He was just a shy young man from North Carolina, with small dreams and what seemed like an ordinary future. But in a single moment at the foot of the cross, his life was turned upside down by a divine calling that would set the entire world on fire. What happened to Billy Graham was not just a personal conversion. It was the beginning of a spiritual revolution that transformed nations, confronted world leaders, shook empires, and reignited a flame of faith in billions of hearts. This is not a simple biography. It's the true story of how a humble boy was raised up by God to become the most influential voice of modern Christianity, the preacher who redefined faith in the 20th century. Get ready. What you're about to discover may challenge the way you believe, and it just might change your life forever. Raised among milk cans and chilly mornings on a farm in Charlotte, North Carolina, Billy Graham learned early to discipline the land, never imagining the world stages. That changed on the night of November 1st, 1934, a revival service led by Mordecai Ham. He stepped out from the pew, walked to the front, and surrendered to Christ, the spark that ignited a fire destined to cross borders and launch a spiritual revolution. In 1936, he briefly attended Bob Jones College. In 1937, he transferred to Florida Bible Institute in Tampa under the mentorship of John Minder. There he trained both voice and heart. He preached his first sermon on Easter Sunday in 1937 and embraced opportunities in missions and tabernacles. In 1938, under a moonlit sky on a golf course, he knelt and whispered, "Lord, if you want me to, I'll preach your gospel for the rest of my life." That moment anchored him, awakening courage and focus. Around the same time, he was baptized and became a member of Peniel Baptist Church. In 1939, that same community witnessed his ordination as a Baptist minister. His compass was the cross. Romans 1 verse 16 was his fuel. "I am not ashamed of the gospel." 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27 revealed God's method. Isaiah 6 verse 8 defined his calling. In 1940, he went on to Wheaton College in Illinois to study anthropology, a decision that served a spiritual purpose. To understand people, read cultures, and speak to the collective conscience. While studying, he preached every chance he got, learning to tell stories that mirrored the audience's pain and invited immediate response. In 1943, he married Ruth Bell. From then on, the message grew, radios tuned in, auditoriums filled. The vision expanded, revival tents rising like cathedrals of canvas. Revival, fire, spiritual revolution, transformation of faith, and eternal impact. Not as slogans, but as living realities that entered homes, prisons, universities, and even parliaments. With a clear voice and a direct invitation, Billy learned to reach the will, not just the emotions, to unite prayer with organization, to blend simplicity with boldness. What began on a church pew in 1934, matured on a golf course in 1938, and gained academic depth in 1940, was now ready to step into the public sphere. And when Los Angeles lifted a cathedral canvas, the world would hear that God still calls, still saves, still sends, and an ordinary life, placed in the right hands, can set continents ablaze. For he was not selling ideas. He was guiding decisions, linking guilt and grace to concrete promises of new life. Faith. The calling that set Billy Graham's heart on fire now needed to be tested against the reality of a world at war and a generation desperate for answers. In 1944, upon graduating from Wheaton College, he gave himself fully to ministry, not just as a preacher, but as a spiritual strategist who believed the message of the cross had to echo far beyond the church walls. Still a young man, he stepped into the pulpit of a small church in Western Springs, Illinois, where his voice carried conviction and simplicity. At the same time, he launched a radio program called Songs in the Night, which quickly became a pioneering platform to bring faith into thousands of American homes. It wasn't just a sermon. It was a fusion of music, words, and emotion, carefully crafted to reach the deepest layers of both mind and heart, like seeds planted in fertile soil. Even then, psychology had already shown that messages repeated in emotionally charged settings have the power to create lasting memories. That's exactly what Billy did, not through manipulation, but through the genuine power of the gospel, with a clear promise that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. John 8 verse 32. His magnetic oratory soon drew attention beyond local boundaries. Chicago Youth for Christ invited him to be their traveling evangelist, And Graham began preaching across universities, military training camps, and packed auditoriums in the middle of World War II. Young soldiers, standing on the edge of life and death, found in his words not vague comfort, but the solid assurance that eternal life was real, that the cross was not a symbol of weakness, but of victory. This season shaped his direct style and his unmistakable urgency. He spoke like a man in a hurry, as if he knew every soul was a countdown on God's clock. Within him was a rare blend, authority with humility, boldness with tenderness. His audiences didn't just listen, they felt compelled to respond. His preaching wasn't simply informative. It was performative, alive with imagery that opened windows in the mind and ignited fire in the heart, like an invisible script leading a person straight to the point of decision. In 1947, at just 29 years old, Billy Graham became president of Northwestern Schools in Minneapolis. It was a bold leap, a young man with no lofty academic titles, yet carrying an unquenchable flame, now leading an institution of higher learning. There, he fused intellect and spirituality, proving that faith and reason are not enemies, but allies in a revolution of values. He trained missionaries, formed leaders, and cemented his reputation as someone who didn't just preach, but prepared entire generations to set the world ablaze with the message of Christ. Newspapers began to mention him, and evangelical leaders realized something different was emerging. A young man who spoke with disarming simplicity, yet carried global reach. His voice would not remain confined to regional halls. The stage was being set for Los Angeles, where history itself would shift, and the world would come to know the preacher who could turn crowds into rivers of faith, reigniting the flame of revival that would sweep across entire continents. Billy Graham's early life was marked by what seemed like a paradox: rural simplicity intertwined with grand dreams, personal insecurity coupled with a boldness that only the Spirit of God could sustain. On his parents' farm, he learned to rise early, tend to cattle, endure the scorching summer heat and the biting cold of winter. That routine forged in him an iron discipline that would later prove essential in his tireless life as a preacher. Yet deep inside, there was a conflict. How could that shy boy, who spoke too quickly and lacked intellectual brilliance, ever become someone of significance? The answer didn't come through human logic, but through the power of a divine calling. In school, he never stood out. Some teachers even considered him average, showing no signs of genius. Yet it was on that unlikely ground that God began planting the seeds of a future revival. Scripture reminds us that God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27, and Billy's life became living proof of that truth. During his years at the Florida Bible Institute, young Billy would spend countless hours walking along the Hillsborough River, preaching sermons out loud that he had written himself, speaking to the trees, the wind, the birds. He practiced his breathing, his tone, and even his pauses, as if he were already standing before a great unseen crowd. Out there, nature became his first congregation, and God was his only listener. That relentless practice helped him overcome timidity and transform his voice into a spiritual weapon. Modern psychology confirms that repetition combined with active imagination rewires the brain with new neural connections, and that's exactly what shaped Graham's magnetic oratory. It wasn't merely natural talent. It was discipline, surrender, and faith molding his mind for his calling. He understood the secret was never in his own ability, but in allowing the Holy Spirit to speak through him. At the same time, his heart burned for spiritual purity. He spent long nights in prayer, often on his knees, asking God for courage to face the crowds. One of the most defining moments came under a starry sky, when Billy knelt on an empty golf course and, with tears streaming down his face, declared, "Lord, I give you every day of my life. If you will, I will preach your gospel to the very end." That simple act of surrender became a turning point. He would later say that in that moment the heavens seemed to open, and an unshakable conviction filled his soul. To the world, he was just another ordinary boy. But to God, he was the preacher of the century, that often overlooked detail. His lonely surrender under the night sky holds the key to understanding why his message would one day set nations ablaze. Before speaking to millions, he first learned to speak with God in the silence. It was a prelude to a spiritual revolution that, like a hidden flame, was about to spread across the earth. The year 1939 marked a decisive turning point in the life of young Billy Graham. After years of spiritual discipline, solitary rehearsals along the banks of the Hillsborough River, and long nights in prayer, he was officially ordained to ministry by Penuel Baptist Church in Palatka, Florida. To the human eye, that moment, witnessed by a small congregation, seemed ordinary, just another young pastor being recognized by his community. But spiritually, what was happening carried cosmic weight. God was raising up an instrument who would bring the gospel to more people than any preacher in history up to that time. It was as if heaven echoed the same call Isaiah once heard. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And he said, "Here am I, send me," Isaiah 6 verse 8. Graham didn't just repeat those words. He embraced them as a lifelong covenant. Soon after his ordination, invitations began arriving for him to preach in small churches and at local gatherings. His early sermons weren't polished, but they carried an unusual intensity. There was something in his voice, a blend of urgency and tenderness, that made listeners lean forward in their pews, not wanting to miss a single word. Unlike many preachers of that era, who relied on rhetorical flourishes and complex speeches, Graham spoke plainly, simply, almost disarmingly. That simplicity became his greatest strength, for it reached both the illiterate farmer and the college student alike. He often said the gospel didn't need human ornamentation to be powerful, because its strength was in the message of the cross itself. That conviction shaped the style the world would come to know: clarity, authority, and a direct appeal to decision. During this time, Graham also distinguished himself by his relentless discipline. He kept a notebook where he recorded every invitation he received, every sermon he preached, and even his shortcomings, later reviewing them to see how he could improve. It was as if he were training not only to preach, but to organize a movement that would reach the masses. His seriousness impressed even the most skeptical. John Minder, one of his mentors, would say, "Billy has a flame in his eyes that never goes out." And indeed, that flame grew brighter. At the same time, he sought deeper knowledge of the scriptures, studying for hours on end, immersing himself in theology, but also in anthropology, because he believed understanding cultures was essential to reaching hearts. This blend of prayer, discipline, study, and practice became the unseen foundation upon which his future global ministry would be built. Those early years of ministry in humble chapels and small auditoriums may look like a mere prelude to something greater, but they already carried clear signs that a historic revival was stirring. Every decision made during his appeals, every tear shed by new converts, every family transformed by his messages were like small rivers that would soon converge into an ocean of spiritual impact. And so, while the world still saw Billy Graham as just a promising young preacher, God already saw him as a herald of the spiritual revolution that would ignite entire nations and transform the way millions viewed the Christian faith. The year 1939 marked a decisive turning point in the life of young Billy Graham. After years of spiritual discipline, solitary rehearsals along the banks of the Hillsborough River, and long nights in prayer, he was officially ordained to ministry by Penuel Baptist Church in Palatka, Florida. To the human eye, that moment, witnessed by a small congregation, seemed ordinary, just another young pastor being recognized by his community. But spiritually, what was happening carried cosmic weight. God was raising up an instrument who would bring the gospel to more people than any preacher in history up to that time. It was as if heaven echoed the same call Isaiah once heard. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And he said, "Here am I, send me," Isaiah 6 verse 8. Graham didn't just repeat those words. He embraced them as a lifelong covenant. Soon after his ordination, invitations began arriving for him to preach in small churches and at local gatherings. His early sermons weren't polished, but they carried an unusual intensity. There was something in his voice, a blend of urgency and tenderness, that made listeners lean forward in their pews, not wanting to miss a single word. Unlike many preachers of that era, who relied on rhetorical flourishes and complex speeches, Graham spoke plainly, simply, almost disarmingly. That simplicity became his greatest strength, for it reached both the illiterate farmer and the college student alike. He often said the gospel didn't need human ornamentation to be powerful, because its strength was in the message of the cross itself. That conviction shaped the style the world would come to know: clarity, authority, and a direct appeal to decision. During this time, Graham also distinguished himself by his relentless discipline. He kept a notebook where he recorded every invitation he received, every sermon he preached, and even his shortcomings, later reviewing them to see how he could improve. It was as if he were training not only to preach, but to organize a movement that would reach the masses. His seriousness impressed even the most skeptical. John Minder, one of his mentors, would say, "Billy has a flame in his eyes that never goes out." And indeed, that flame grew brighter. At the same time, he sought deeper knowledge of the scriptures, studying for hours on end, immersing himself in theology, but also in anthropology, because he believed understanding cultures was essential to reaching hearts. This blend of prayer, discipline, study, and practice became the unseen foundation upon which his future global ministry would be built. Those early years of ministry in humble chapels and small auditoriums may look like a mere prelude to something greater, but they already carried clear signs that a historic revival was stirring. Every decision made during his appeals, every tear shed by new converts, every family transformed by his messages were like small rivers that would soon converge into an ocean of spiritual impact. And so, while the world still saw Billy Graham as just a promising young preacher, God already saw him as a herald of the spiritual revolution that would ignite entire nations and transform the way millions viewed the Christian faith. Between 1937 and 1940, Billy Graham lived through one of the most intense and defining seasons of his life, when he enrolled at the Florida Bible Institute in Tampa. Until then, his faith had been like a growing flame, but there it turned into an uncontrollable fire. The atmosphere of the Institute was electric. Professors who breathed passion for the scriptures, classmates consumed with the urgency of missions, and a spiritual climate that felt alive. Yet, what truly marked those years were the practical experiences that shaped his identity as a preacher. Every afternoon, Billy would walk to the Hillsborough River, where he preached aloud to the trees and the birds. At first glance, it seemed absurd, a skinny young man shouting into the empty air. But in reality, he was training his voice, his diction, and his courage to face an audience. In the solitude of nature, every word echoed back to him as if heaven itself were listening. The shy boy from North Carolina was beginning to forge the boldness that would one day captivate crowds in stadiums and arenas. It was also during this time that he experienced one of the most decisive nights of his life. In 1938, while walking alone across an abandoned golf course, he felt his knees beneath the starry sky and, with tears streaming down his face, declared, "Lord, if you will, I will preach your gospel for the rest of my life." That prayer was more than a request. It was a complete surrender, almost a spiritual hypnosis, in which his mind, heart, and body aligned with an eternal purpose. When he rose from the grass, he was no longer an uncertain young man, but someone branded by a calling. Years later, he would look back on that moment as the turning point that sealed his destiny. It was as if the Holy Spirit himself had etched into his soul, "You are my preacher to the nations." The promise of Jeremiah 1 verse 5 seemed to come alive. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." In 1939, Graham was baptized in water, publicly reaffirming his surrender, and soon after, he was officially ordained into ministry by the Peniel Baptist Church. That act was a visible seal of what had already been burning invisibly in his heart. From a timid teenager, he was now recognized as God's messenger, ready to step onto pulpits and proclaim the word. There was no turning back. His life was consecrated. This season at the Florida Bible Institute was far more than theological training. It was a true laboratory of the supernatural, where human discipline met divine intervention to mold one of the greatest preachers in history. What seemed like nothing more than lonely practice by the riverside was, in reality, the rehearsal for a spiritual revolution that would soon set nations ablaze. At the Florida Bible Institute, Billy Graham had trained his voice preaching to the quiet banks of the Hillsborough River. But soon, God would lead him to the next step, speaking before real people. It was during that same period, in 1937 and 1938, that the first invitations came for small services in local churches, prayer meetings, and even open-air gatherings. The young evangelist, shy and still unsure of himself, approached each invitation as if stepping onto a battlefield. His hands would sweat, his heart would race, and his mind would go blank before those first small groups of listeners. But the moment he opened the Bible, everything changed. It was as if the shyness dissolved and his voice carried a strength that was not his own. Every word came forth with burning conviction, as though the message burned within him until it had to be proclaimed. He knew it wasn't natural eloquence, but the Holy Spirit working through his weakness. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 4. Those first experiences were marked by unlikely situations. At one outdoor service, he preached to only a handful of people sitting on makeshift chairs, yet the atmosphere felt as solemn as a cathedral. On another occasion, invited at the last minute to replace a preacher who hadn't shown up, he spoke without a single outline, relying only on a few verses he had memorized, and he saw tears streaming down the faces of men hardened by work and life struggles. For Billy, each of these moments was proof that his surrender on the golf course had not been in vain. Though he was young, inexperienced, and lacked advanced academic training, there was a fire within him that no one could extinguish. But it wasn't only victories. There were also stumbles, sermons that came out confused, messages poorly structured, and even times when listeners yawned or seemed indifferent. Instead of discouraging him, those frustrations became tools of growth. Graham threw himself into studying how to craft a sermon, how to capture an audience's attention, how to use tone and even silence as instruments of impact. He practiced in front of a mirror, took detailed notes, and sought guidance from more seasoned preachers. Slowly, he realized that passion alone was not enough. Method mattered too. Those years of public practice became his true training ground. It was there, before small gatherings and modest crowds, that the young evangelist forged the spiritual and communicative weapons he would soon wield before multitudes. Every sermon was a seed planted. Every invitation a chance to witness people respond to the call of the cross. He saw power when even one person stood up and said yes to Christ, and it filled him with courage, as if each individual decision was the beginning of a coming revival. What seemed like the humble start of a limited ministry was, in reality, the rehearsal for a spiritual revolution that was about to reach unimaginable heights. In 1949, years of preparation converged into a historic breaking point. The Los Angeles Crusade, an event that not only catapulted Billy Graham onto the national stage, but also marked the beginning of a new chapter in worldwide evangelism. That fall, what was first planned as a 3-week series stretched into 8 consecutive weeks, because what was happening under the great white tent in the heart of the city far exceeded every expectation. Cars lined the streets for blocks, crowds fought for seats, and journalists rushed to uncover how a young, virtually unknown preacher was drawing thousands night after night. The answer wasn't found in human strategy, but in the fire of the Spirit being poured out, transforming hearts on a massive scale. Before the eyes of an entire generation, the promise of Joel 2 verse 28 was unfolding. Asterisk, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Asterisk, a decisive factor was the attention of the press. Media tycoon William Randolph Hearst, struck by the reports, sent his now famous order to his newspapers. Asterisk, Puff Graham. Asterisk in journalistic terms, it meant asterisk, give this man coverage. Asterisk suddenly, reporters and photographers packed the tent, multiplying the reach of the message. At a time when television was still in its infancy, the power of print media lifted Billy Graham from a regional preacher to a national figure. It was as if God himself was sovereignly using even secular tools to amplify the message of the cross. What began as a local revival turned into a collective spiritual phenomenon, a movement that shook not only the churches, but also the very culture of America. The messages were simple yet piercing. Billy spoke about sin without hesitation, lifted up the cross as the only solution, and called men and women to make an immediate decision for Christ. His direct appeal, combined with stirring music led by Cliff Barrows and the unmistakable voice of George Beverly Shea, created an atmosphere that felt almost hypnotic, yet was grounded in the authenticity of the gospel. Social psychologists would later note that decisions made in moments of heightened emotion often have a greater chance of leading to real change. That is exactly what unfolded night after night. Hundreds walking down the center aisle to surrender their lives to Christ. Among the converts were police officers, businessmen, college students, homemakers, and even members of Hollywood's elite. The impact was so visible that newspapers described the atmosphere as a spiritual earthquake. The Los Angeles Crusade established a pattern that would define Graham's ministry for decades. Fervent prayer behind the scenes, strategic use of the media, absolute clarity in the message, music as emotional preparation, and an irresistible call to decision. It wasn't just another evangelistic campaign. It was the beginning of a global movement that would set cities ablaze, reignite faith across nations, and leave a legacy of spiritual transformation and eternal impact. That 10 in Los Angeles became an improvised cathedral, where heaven and earth met, and the story of Christian faith in the 20th century was changed forever. The weeks in Los Angeles in 1949 didn't end in silence, but with a thunderclap that echoed across the nation. The young preacher from North Carolina, until then known only in evangelical circles, now graced the front pages of America's largest newspapers. Photos of the massive white tent packed with crowds, the endless lines of conversions, and the presence of celebrities and politicians alongside ordinary men and women painted an undeniable picture of revival. Editors, stirred by the directive of William Randolph Hearst, had ignited a wave of collective curiosity. Who was this preacher with piercing eyes and a direct message, who could draw thousands without promising a spectacle? Only the message of the cross? Post-war America, weighed down by Cold War fears and nuclear anxiety, seemed to have finally found a voice that offered not just comfort, but decision. Life or loss, Christ or emptiness. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes. Romans 1 verse 16. Invitations began to pour in. Churches, universities, and entire cities asked Billy Graham and his team to bring that fire to them as well. The young preacher, who just a few years earlier had been rehearsing sermons by the riverbank, was now being called to arenas and auditoriums that symbolized the cultural power of the nation. One of the first major invitations after Los Angeles came in 1950 for a crusade in Portland, Oregon, where once again tens of thousands flocked to hear him. Soon followed commitments in Boston, Washington, Atlanta, Memphis, and each city became a laboratory of faith, multiplying the formula of fervent prayer, stirring music, and a direct call to decision. At the same time, international leaders began writing, asking for his presence in London, Tokyo, Berlin. The Los Angeles Crusade had not been an isolated event. It was the opening of a global door. As his popularity grew, so did the challenges. Critics from liberal circles dismissed his gospel as too simplistic. But Graham never wavered. He always responded with humility and conviction, affirming that the gospel did not need intellectual complexity to carry power. The public, for their part, didn't seem to care about academic critique. Entire families were converted. Young people offered themselves for ministry, and civic leaders sought him out for spiritual guidance. University presidents invited him to speak to students. Military leaders asked him to preach on bases. Radio stations and newspapers competed for interviews. What had begun as a revival under a tent was now becoming a sweeping spiritual revolution, a national awakening that would soon cross borders. By 1950, a new stage was unfolding. International invitations, especially from England, were beginning to take shape. Billy Graham understood that God was expanding his mission field, and that the United States was only a springboard for worldwide revival. He told his team, "The gospel does not belong to one nation, but to all." Echoing Matthew 28 verse 19, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." And so, while America burned with spiritual fire, the young preacher's eyes were already fixed across the Atlantic. What was coming next would not merely be the expansion of territory, but the confirmation that the call he received back in 1934 was never meant to be local, but global, an eternal impact that would reshape the face of Christianity on a worldwide scale. In 1940, Billy Graham left Florida and moved to Illinois, enrolling at Wheaton College, one of the most respected evangelical institutions in the United States. His decision to study anthropology seemed odd to some of his classmates, who expected him to go straight into theology. But Billy had a different vision. He believed that to preach the gospel effectively, he needed to understand human beings in all their diversity, their cultures, behaviors, and struggles. The gospel is for all nations, he would say, recalling the words of Matthew 28 verse 19. "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations." For him, anthropology was a bridge, a way to understand how people lived, so he could communicate Christ clearly on campus. Graham wasn't the brightest student in terms of grades, but he was recognized for his discipline, seriousness, and uncommon dedication. His routine blended rigorous classes, late-night reading, and constant preaching practice whenever opportunities arose in local churches. At Wheaton, Billy found a circle of young people hungry for revival. Many were shaken by the global situation. World War II was already devastating Europe, and Americans wondered when their own nation would be pulled into the conflict. This climate of uncertainty gave worship services and prayer meetings a special weight. Billy stood out in these gatherings. His prayers were fervent, his faith contagious, and his willingness to fully surrender to his calling inspired his peers. He often said that every night of prayer at Wheaton felt like a rehearsal for something greater, as if the Holy Spirit were tuning his voice and strengthening his heart for crowds that were yet to come. Wheaton also gave him something that would deeply shape his life, a vision of faith that united Christian intellect with spiritual fervor. There, Graham learned he didn't have to choose between head and heart, reason and faith. He could study, reflect, and dialogue with scholars, and still keep the fire of the gospel burning in his preaching. This integration would later give him credibility with political leaders, journalists, and academics who saw in him not just a fiery preacher, but a man with intellectual depth, able to engage in serious dialogue across different arenas. This period was marked by strict discipline. Graham woke up early, studied long hours, and spent his afternoons rehearsing sermons or joining evangelistic activities. He took notes, reviewed Bible passages, and constantly sought clarity in his communication. If at the Florida Bible Institute he had learned to project his voice and overcome shyness, at Wheaton he learned to shape the message, to give intellectual and spiritual form to the content that would soon ignite multitudes. It was as if God was polishing every aspect of his life, body, mind, and spirit working together in harmony for ministry with eternal impact. Thus, Wheaton was more than just an academic chapter. It was a strategic training ground where a young man from North Carolina was being prepared as a preacher for a new century. Every anthropology class, every night of prayer, every impromptu sermon before his peers were pieces of a great mosaic that would later be completed. And there in the heart of Illinois, another decisive story began. His encounter with Ruth Bell, a meeting that would change not only his personal life, but the entire future of his ministry. Life at Wheaton for Billy Graham was not defined solely by academics and rigorous study. It was there that his faith matured and his vision for future broadened. The campus, alive with young Christians striving to reconcile faith with science, became fertile ground for him to explore new dimensions of his calling. While many students saw the war in Europe as a distant backdrop, Graham sensed that the world was on the brink of spiritual collapse. He spent countless hours in the library, immersing himself in both biblical texts and secular works, always convinced that all knowledge should serve the greater purpose of proclaiming Christ. On weekends, he accepted invitations to preach in small churches and youth groups across Illinois. Each sermon was like a workshop where he refined his delivery, sharpened his voice, and tested the clarity of his appeals. He often repeated the principle: if it isn't clear, it isn't effective. This commitment to simplicity and depth will become his hallmark. It was also at Wheaton that Billy met Ruth Bell, the daughter of Presbyterian missionaries who had served for many years in China. Ruth was a young woman of unshakable faith, passionate about missions, with a heart turned toward peoples who had yet to hear the gospel. From an early age, she carried the dream of return to Asia as a missionary, bringing the message of Christ to the East. When she met Billy, she saw in him not just another student, but a man ablaze with God, someone who carried the unwavering conviction that his life was not his own, but belonged to the kingdom. Their connection was almost inevitable. Their visions of life converged on one essential point: living fully for God. The relationship, however, was not easy at first. Ruth dreamed of China, while Billy was beginning to realize that his calling was to preach to the masses in the West. There was tension between their personal dreams and God's greater plan, but constant prayer began shaping them both. Billy often said he saw in Ruth a spiritual strength he lacked himself, a courage that pushed him beyond his own limits. Ruth, on the other hand, admired Billy's clarity and urgency when he spoke about the cross. Their bond was not merely romantic, but profoundly spiritual. Two lives shaped by different cultures converging into one purpose. Amid classes, chapel services, and long conversations, a love was born, not built merely on human affinity, but rooted in eternal convictions. In 1941, they officially began courting, and in the years that followed, their relationship deepened. Ruth tested Billy with direct questions about his missionary vision, and he always answered with the same fire. "God has called me to preach, and I will preach wherever he opens the doors." That growing alignment prepared the way for a union that would be far more than marriage. It would be a ministry partnership. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. Ecclesiastes 4 verse 9. That biblical truth will be fulfilled in their lives in an extraordinary way. By the time Billy finished his years at Wheaton, he had not only earned a degree in anthropology, but had also found a companion who would become his intercessor, counselor, and quiet strength in every future decision. Ruth would not be just the wife of a preacher, but an inseparable part of a calling that would soon set the world ablaze. Their meeting at Wheaton was, therefore, as decisive as a conversion in 1934, a turning point that sealed not only his personal life, but also the future of millions who would be reached through his ministry. On August 13, 1943, in a simple yet deeply spiritual ceremony, Billy Graham and Ruth Bell joined their lives in marriage. He was a young preacher from the American South, still in the early stages of his ministry, and she was a daughter of Presbyterian missionaries who had grown up in China, carried with her the courage and discipline of a missionary's life. Their union was more than a romantic bond. It was a divine partnership destined to uphold a work that would transform the world. Ruth brought with her a strong and tested faith, shaped by the sacrifices she had witnessed in her parents' mission in the Far East. Billy, on the other hand, carried the fire of a national and soon global calling. Together, they became like two pillars of the same temple. The ceremony reflected the simplicity they both valued. There was no luxury or extravagance, but something far more precious: the conviction that God was uniting two lives for an eternal purpose. Close friends would later recall that the sparkle in Ruth's eyes was not just the joy of a bride in love, but the vision of a woman who saw in her husband a vessel chosen by God. Likewise, Billy often said that in marrying Ruth, he gained not only a life companion, but also a constant intercessor, someone who would uphold him in prayer during the most difficult moments. The spiritual dimension of their marriage became evident in every stage of their ministry. In the early years of their life together, Ruth proved to be not just a devoted wife, but also a tireless partner. While Billy traveled to preach in small churches and student gatherings, Ruth took care of their home, always keeping faith at the center of their family. Later, when children came, she became the cornerstone of the household, raising them in an atmosphere of prayer and discipline, even when Billy was away for long evangelistic campaigns. Many biographers agree that without Ruth, Billy's ministry would never have reached the magnitude it did. Her quiet yet decisive role was like the unseen columns holding up a great cathedral. Marriage also brought Billy a new sense of maturity. He was no longer just a shy young man from North Carolina practicing sermons by the riverbank. He was now a husband, carrying the responsibility of a growing family, along with an increasingly demanding call to ministry. That weight of responsibility drove him to seek greater discipline in his spiritual life. He spent hours in prayer before each sermon, carefully revised his outlines, and dedicated himself to studying the scriptures in depth. Ruth encouraged that discipline, often reminding him that true success wasn't found in crowds, but in staying faithful to God's call. Their marriage was also a living example for the young people of their generation. At a time when many viewed marriage as a social arrangement, Billy and Ruth showed that life together could itself be a ministry. Their choices of simplicity, faithfulness, and purpose inspired others to devote their lives fully to God. Their love was real, but always submitted to a greater love, Christ himself. Over the years, their bond would be tested by distance, ministry pressures, and public criticism, yet it stood firm until the very end of their lives. Thus, their 1943 wedding was not merely a private chapter in Billy Graham's biography. It was a spiritual milestone, the foundation of partnership that would sustain crusades, missions, historic decisions, and the raising of a family that became a living testimony of the gospel. With Ruth by his side, Billy was more prepared than ever to face the world. Soon after marrying Ruth, in 1943, Billy Graham took on his first official pastorate at the village church of Western Springs, just outside Chicago. The congregation was small, made up mostly of working-class families from the area. At first glance, it seemed like a modest ministry with little potential for growth. Yet it was in that very setting that Billy began shaping the style that would one day fill stadiums and arenas. He approached every service as if he were standing before a vast crowd, preaching to 50 people with the same passion and fire he would later bring to 50,000. His conviction was unshakable. The size of the audience didn't matter, because every soul held eternal worth before God. Asterisk, for what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Asterisk, Mark 8, verse 36. That mindset would define his entire ministry. At the village church, Billy blended discipline with innovation. He introduced more fervent weekly prayer meetings, encouraged young people to take on responsibilities in the church, and valued music as a powerful spiritual tool. It was also there that he began to see the power of modern communication. In January 1944, alongside baritone George Beverly Shea, he launched the radio program Songs and Night, broadcast from a small station in Chicago. The idea was bold: combine high-quality Christian music with short, direct, and impactful messages. The program quickly reached hundreds of homes, and letters from listeners poured in, sharing stories of conversions, family reconciliations, and spiritual renewal. What began as a local outreach became the prototype for what Graham would later do on a national and eventually global scale. Harness every available medium to proclaim the gospel. At that time, radio was the most powerful medium in American homes. Television was still in its infancy, while radio shaped opinions, set cultural trends, and brought families together each evening. Graham realized that if secular culture used the airwaves to entertain and influence, the gospel deserved that same space to save. Songs in the Night became more than just a program. It was like an invisible worship service, a virtual tent pitched over homes, hospitals, and military barracks. The blend of Shea's rich, commanding voice and Billy's clear, urgent message created an almost hypnotic atmosphere, where minds were stirred to reflect and hearts were pressed to decide. Billy's time in Western Springs was brief, but it was pivotal. Before long, he was already recognized as a young pastor with a vision far beyond the walls of his small church. He displayed organization, leadership, and creativity. He prepared every sermon with care, studied the psychology of communication, tracked the outcomes of his meetings, and constantly thought about how to reach more people. Yet, despite his growing influence, he never lost the humility and simplicity of a farmer's son. Ruth, always by his side, supported their home and encouraged her husband at every step, even as his travels and commitments began to multiply. The village church of Western Springs became a spiritual laboratory. It was there that a young pastor trained his voice, honed his methods, and built his discipline. Never imagining that within just a few years he would become the most influential preacher of the 20th century. The radio broadcasts, the small gatherings of pastoral care, all of it formed part of a greater mosaic God was arranging to soon launch Billy Graham onto national stages. What looked like a modest ministry was, in truth, the dress rehearsal for a spiritual revolution that would soon prove unstoppable. Right after marrying Ruth, Billy Graham took on his first official pastorate in 1943 at the village church of Western Springs, just outside Chicago. The congregation was small, made up mostly of working-class families from the area. At first glance, it looked like a modest ministry with little promise of growth. But it was in that very setting that Billy began shaping the style that would later ignite stadiums and arenas. He treated every service as if he were standing before a massive crowd, preaching with the same passion to 50 people as he would to 50,000. His conviction was firm. The size of the audience didn't matter. Every soul carried eternal value before God. Asterisk, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Asterisk, Mark 8, verse 36. That mindset would define his entire ministry. At Village Church, Billy combined discipline with innovation. He introduced more fervent weekly prayer meetings, encouraged young people to take on responsibilities in the church, and elevated music as a spiritual tool. It was also there that he began to see the power of modern communication. In January 1944, alongside baritone George Beverly Shea, he launched the radio program Songs in the Night, broadcast from a small station in Chicago. The idea was bold: blend high-quality Christian music with short, direct, and impactful messages. The program quickly reached hundreds of homes, and letters from listeners poured in, sharing stories of conversions, family reconciliations, and spiritual renewal. What began as a local experiment soon became a prototype of what Graham would later do on national and eventually global scale: use every available medium to proclaim the gospel. At the time, radio was the most powerful medium in American households. Television was still in its infancy, but radio shaped opinions, set cultural trends, and gathered families together around evening broadcasts. Graham understood that if secular culture used the airwaves to entertain and influence, the gospel should claim the same space to save. Songs in the Night became more than just a program. It was an invisible service, a virtual tent pitched over homes, hospitals, and barracks. The combination of Shea's powerful voice and Billy's clear, compelling message created an almost hypnotic atmosphere, leading minds to reflect and hearts to decide. Though his time in Western Springs was brief, it proved to be pivotal. In a short span, Billy Graham was already recognized as a young pastor with a vision that extended far beyond his church walls. He showed remarkable organization, leadership, and creativity. He carefully prepared each sermon, studied the psychology of communication, tracked the outcomes of services, and was already strategizing about how to reach more people. At the same time, he maintained the humility and simplicity of a farm boy. Ruth, always by his side, kept the home steady and encouraged her husband at every step. Even as his travels and commitments began to grow, the village church of Western Springs became a spiritual laboratory. There, a young pastor trained his voice, honed his methods, and built his discipline, without imagining that in just a few years, he would become the most influential preacher of the 20th century. The radio broadcasts, the small gatherings, the pastoral care, all were pieces of mosaic God was putting together, preparing to launch Billy Graham onto the national stage. What looked like a modest ministry was, in truth, the dress rehearsal for a spiritual revolution that would soon become unstoppable. The years 1946 and 1947 marked the decisive expansion of Billy Graham as an itinerant evangelist. Youth for Christ sent him on campaigns that stretched not only across the United States, but also opened doors to his first international experiences. In the U.S., Graham preached in packed gymnasiums, makeshift tents, and even military bases, reaching thousands of young people whose faces still carried the marks of war. Recently discharged soldiers, grieving families, and students uncertain about the future found in his messages of clarity that political speeches could not offer. There was sin, but there was a cross. There was despair, but there was hope. There was death, but there was eternal life. The appeal was simple, yet it cut deep. Christ died for you, and today he is calling you. In March 1946, Billy set out on his first international trip with the YFC team, crossing the Atlantic to England. The country was still breathing the ruins of World War II, bombed-out buildings, broken families, and a generation steeped in disillusionment. Preaching in churches and auditoriums, Graham quickly realized that collective pain had created an immense hunger for the gospel. There was no theological sophistication in his sermons. There was urgency. Crowds packed ruined sanctuaries and community halls, and hundreds responded to Christ's call. That impact left a deep mark on the young evangelist's heart. He began to see the gospel not only as a personal answer, but as a balm for entire nations. In 1947, Graham returned to Europe, this time preaching in countries like Sweden, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Everywhere, the same phenomenon unfolded: broken hearts finding strength in the message of the cross. For Billy, those trips became a hands-on training ground. He learned how to work with the international press, organize large events, and cooperate with churches of different denominations. What could have been just a missionary internship turned into a glimpse of what was to come: crusades with global impact. But at that point, Graham was not yet the preacher of the century the media would later proclaim. He was simply a young man committed to faithful preaching, unaware that newspapers and radio stations would soon be chasing after him. Those journeys also helped him solidify his team. Cliff Barrows, whom he had met by chance on a honeymoon trip in 1945, was now stepping into a central role as master of ceremonies and music leader. George Beverly Shea, with his unmistakable baritone voice, was becoming an essential part of the spiritual heartbeat of the Crusades. Together, they formed a trio that blended preaching, music, and appeal in perfect synergy. This simple yet powerful formula proved effective both in the U.S. and in Europe, and would be repeated countless times in the decades ahead. The international experiences of 1946 and 1947 ignited in Billy a burning conviction. The gospel did not belong to one people or culture. Before his eyes, he saw the living confirmation of the promise in Acts 1 verse 8. "You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Though he did not yet fully grasp the scale of his future ministry, the young evangelist was beginning to glimpse that God was preparing him for something far greater than he had ever dreamed. In 1947, at just 28 years old, Billy Graham accepted a challenge many would consider far too bold for someone so young. He became president of Northwestern Schools in Minneapolis, an institution made up of a seminary, a Bible school, and a Christian academy. It was a massive step for the young evangelist, who until then had been focused mainly on youth crusades and missionary trips. Now, beyond the pulpit, he carried the weight of overseeing faculty, students, finances, and the school's academic vision. Many were surprised by the decision, since Graham had little administrative experience, but he possessed qualities that inspired trust: iron discipline, transparency, and a charisma that drew people together around a purpose. His leadership philosophy was simple. School should not just be a place of intellectual training, but a seedbed for men and women ignited by the Spirit, ready to take the gospel to the world. During his years at Northwestern, Graham displayed remarkable organizational skill. He introduced daily prayer services, strengthened the faculty, encouraged students to actively engage in local evangelism, and established standards of integrity that would mark his entire ministry. It was also there that his conviction deepened. The gospel could not be confined within four walls, whether it was school or church. He reminded students that Christian faith had to be active, missionary, and public. Many young people who studied under his guidance later became pastors, missionaries, and leaders who carried on the revival legacy sparked by their dean. It was during the same period, in 1948, that Billy and his evangelistic team drafted what would become historic: the Modesto Manifesto. Gathered in a hotel in California, they agreed on four non-negotiable principles designed to safeguard the integrity of the ministry. 1. Complete transparency in handling money, to avoid any suspicion of exploitation. 2. Uncompromising standards of moral purity, to protect themselves from sexual scandal. 3. A commitment never to criticize local churches, but to work in cooperation with them. 4. Total honesty in reporting attendance and conversions, steering clear of sensational exaggerations. These principles became the backbone of Billy Graham's credibility, shielding his ministry from the accusations that destroyed other evangelists of his era. "For we are taking pains to do what is right, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of men," 2 Corinthians 8 verse 21. Even while leading Northwestern, Billy never stopped preaching. He continued traveling with Youth for Christ campaigns, as well as through independent invitations, carefully balancing both roles. This season tested his physical and spiritual endurance, as the demands were intense, but also cemented in him a dual vision: to evangelize the masses and prepare future generations. Many biographers note that this balance between the fire of evangelism and the discipline of education was crucial for him later on, enabling him to sustain a global organization without losing sight of the message. His presidency at Northwestern Schools lasted only a few years, but it was enough to prove that Billy Graham was more than a charismatic preacher. He was also a strategist capable of planning, structuring, and building teams. It was here that the administrative and ethical foundations were laid that would later uphold the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, BGA. The young farm boy from North Carolina, who once preached to the trees along the Hillsborough River, had now become a recognized leader in classrooms, auditoriums, and churches, paving the way for the most impactful season of his life. In 1948 and 1949, Billy Graham began to realize that his ministry needed a stronger structure beyond the youth crusades of Youth for Christ. While his experience with YFC had been foundational, he understood that God's calling on his life required a broader vision, one that could unite churches, mobilize volunteers, and reach crowds on a national scale. During this time, he and his team, already formed by Cliff Barrows as music director, George Beverly Shea as soloist, and his childhood friend Grady Wilson as his right-hand man, started organizing independent campaigns in different American cities. Each event became a testing ground for evangelistic methods. They rehearsed publicity strategies, studied how to prepare the audience with choirs and testimonies, trained counselors to guide new converts after each decision. The goal wasn't just to fill tents, but to build a sustainable process of discipleship. It was also during this period that Billy Graham matured the idea of founding an association to provide organizational support for his ministry. The Future Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, BGA, officially established in 1950. But even in 1948 and 1949, the first outlines were already taking shape. Graham believed that preaching alone was not enough. It was necessary to record, publish, use media, train teams, and ensure that every person reached would be connected to a local church. This strategic vision showed that he was not just an inspired preacher, but a builder of movements. America in those years lived under the shadow of the Cold War, which had begun soon after World War II. The fear of the atomic bomb, the rise of communism, and the sense of spiritual emptiness were palpable. Billy recognized that there was an urgency in the hearts of the American people, and that this void needed to be filled with the message of the cross. His sermons, though simple, carried that sense of urgency. Today is the day of salvation, 2 Corinthians 6 verse 2. The public saw in him not just a pastor, but a voice interpreting their collective fears and offering an eternal solution. By 1948, Graham was already holding crusades in cities like Charlotte, his hometown, Augusta, and Columbia, drawing crowds that filled gyms and tents. In each campaign, the pattern was the same: fervent prayer behind the scenes, music as an emotional bridge, a clear message about sin and the cross, and a direct call to decision. And with each campaign, the number of converts grew, as did media attention. Local newspapers began reporting on the young Southern evangelist who could gather thousands without promising a spectacle, armed only with the Bible in his hand. These years were the direct preparation for what would happen in 1949 in Los Angeles. Everything Graham had learned until then, the discipline of farm life, the solitary practice by the river, the training at Florida Bible Institute, the intellectual formation at Wheaton, the partnership with Ruth, the pastorate in Western Springs, radio, travels with Youth for Christ, the presidency at Northwestern, the Modesto Manifesto, and the independent campaigns, all converge into a single moment, the national stage. God was aligning the pieces of a vast mosaic, and soon the world would meet not just Billy Graham the preacher, but a revivalist who would set an entire generation on fire. The year 1949 would become a decisive turning point in the life of Billy Graham and, consequently, in 20th century Christianity. Invited by a committee of local churches, he agreed to lead a series of evangelistic meetings under a massive tent, popularly known as the Canvas Cathedral, set up in a parking lot at the corner of Washington Boulevard and Hill Street in Los Angeles. Originally planned to last just 3 weeks, the crusade seemed like nothing more than another campaign among the many he had already led across American cities. But there was something different in the air, a spiritual expectancy that couldn't be measured by the organizers alone. From the very first service in September, crowds began gathering beneath the white canvas. The atmosphere was charged with revival, as though every word preached carried spiritual electricity. Graham, only 30 years old, preached with his Bible held high, his clear voice cutting through the California night as he boldly repeated, "The Bible says," that simple yet powerful refrain gave his words an authority listeners could not ignore. The first few days were already remarkable. Each night, the number of attendees grew, and soon the chairs weren't enough. People crowded outside, standing just to catch his voice through the loudspeakers. What was striking wasn't only the size of the crowd, but its diversity. Workers, businessmen, Hollywood stars, soldiers, young students, housewives. Everyone seemed drawn to a message of disarming simplicity. Graham preached about sin, judgment, and salvation, but always pointed to the cross as the only way. His invitation at the end was straightforward. Stand up, come forward, and give your life to Christ. And night after night, hundreds responded, filling the aisles with tears and decisions. The atmosphere of fervor quickly caught the media's attention. Local reporters began covering the event, calling it a spiritual earthquake, shaking the city. Not long after, William Randolph Hearst's now famous order, Puff Graham, triggered nationwide coverage. Newspapers from across the country sent correspondence, and suddenly the young preacher from North Carolina was splashed across headlines declaring, "Revival comes to Los Angeles." The press, which often looked skeptically at evangelists, could no longer ignore the magnitude of the movement. The tent had become the stage for something far greater than a religious gathering. It was a spark of a spiritual revolution that reached into the very heart of American culture. That beginning in Los Angeles showed that everything Graham had lived up to that point, his conversion in 1934, his discipline at the Florida Bible Institute, the surrender on the golf course, his years at Wheaton, his marriage to Ruth, the radio ministry, Youth for Christ, the presidency at Northwestern, the Modesto Pledge, all converged in that moment. It was as if heaven itself had been preparing for decades for this striking ignition. What first appeared to be just another evangelistic campaign would prove to be a milestone in history. The night when the voice of a young evangelist became the roar of a national revival. What began in Los Angeles as a 3-week evangelistic campaign turned into something far greater than any organizer could have imagined. As the days went by, the crowds grew overwhelmingly large, forcing the team not just to extend the crusade by a few days, but by an astonishing 8 consecutive weeks. The massive tent set up in the parking lot could no longer hold the people, and thousands gathered outside, desperate to hear the voice of the young preacher who spoke of sin and redemption with the Bible lifted high. Each night felt more intense than the last. While Los Angeles carried on with its glamorous rhythm of movies, music, and pop culture, there, in the heart of the city, stood an improvised cathedral where eternity itself felt tangible. The press, driven by William Randolph Hearst's now famous telegram, Puff Graham, not only covered the events but amplified them nationwide. Newspapers like the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco News, and soon outlets in New York and Chicago ran headlines about the young evangelist who was shaking Hollywood. Reporters described his stirring altar calls, the choirs led by Cliff Barrows, the deep and moving voice of George Beverly Shea, and most of all, the hundreds of people walking forward in tears. Among them were names that drew even greater public attention, like singer Stuart Hamblin, a radio celebrity who abandoned a life of addiction and indulgence to follow Christ. His conversion sent shockwaves through the entertainment world and was widely reported, proving that the gospel's power could reach even the icons of popular culture. Every night seemed to confirm that something extraordinary was unfolding. Pastors from different denominations gathered around the pulpit to support Graham, and local churches began to experience a spontaneous revival. Entire families were converted, marriages were restored, young people dedicated their lives to ministry. There were reports of bars sitting empty and entire neighborhoods transformed by the spiritual atmosphere of the crusade. A city often seen as a symbol of superficiality and fleeting fame was now the stage for a genuine awakening. So if the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. John 8 verse 36, echoed in every public decision, becoming the banner for countless personal testimonies. This extended crusade elevated Billy Graham from a promising evangelist to a national figure. Magazines called him the preacher who made Los Angeles stop and the new voice of America. His uncompromising stance against sin, coupled with his compassion, earned respect even from skeptics. What was happening under that canvas tent could no longer be ignored. It was the birth of a movement that crossed denominational and geographical boundaries. Los Angeles did not just launch him, Los Angeles crowned him. There, before the press, the crowds, and Christian leaders, it became clear that Billy Graham had ceased to be just a traveling preacher and had become the voice of a national revival that would soon spread across the world. When the 8 weeks of the Los Angeles crusade finally came to an end in November 1949, Billy Graham's life would never be the same. The young man who once preached by the banks of a river in Florida was now making headlines across the nation. Invitations began flooding his office. Churches, universities, sports arenas, and committees from countless cities were asking him to bring the same message that had set Los Angeles ablaze. The crusade had become the symbol of a collective revival, and everyone wanted to be part of that fire. What was most striking was the diversity of these invitations. They came from conservative and liberal pastors alike, from student organizations and from veterans associations, all drawn to the clarity and irresistible power of his message. In that moment, Graham realized he could no longer depend on makeshift structures or third-party organizations. It was time to build a ministry on solid ground, one that could carry forward a movement born under that tent in Los Angeles. Out of that vision came the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, BGA, officially founded in 1950, but already taking shape in the final months of 1949. The idea was both simple and monumental: to bring together resources, technology, and trained teams to multiply crusades in different cities, ensuring the impact would not fade, but instead spread wider and deeper. Magazines, radio broadcasts, television programs, printed publications, and even films would soon be used as tools to carry the gospel beyond physical boundaries. The effect of Los Angeles was compared to a wave that, once it breaks, sends currents rushing in every direction. Local pastors spoke of renewed churches, transformed communities, and new ministries born out crusade. Politicians and business leaders also acknowledged its importance, though from different perspectives. Some saw in Graham a voice of moral stability for a nation locked in the Cold War, while others recognized him as a spiritual leader able to unite different religious groups around the cross. But above all, for the multitudes who had answered his call, he was the preacher who had led them to Christ, the instrument of a revival that reignited faith across America. Los Angeles, then, was far more than a momentary victory. It was Billy Graham's public consecration as the evangelist of a generation, and the prelude to something even greater. His team was now more unified than ever. Cliff Barrows directed massive choirs with flawless precision. George Beverly Shea moved crowds to tears with hymns that softened hearts, and Ruth, steady and prayerful, reminded her husband to keep his feet on the ground and his eyes on the cross. Everything was in place for the fire that began in Los Angeles to spread to other cities in the years ahead, and eventually to continents far beyond. That young man from North Carolina had become, before the eyes of an entire nation, the voice of a spiritual movement destined to leave an eternal mark. At the close of this first chapter, Billy Graham's journey unfolds as a divine mosaic, each piece fitting perfectly into God's design. The shy farm boy from Charlotte, shaped by hard work and rural discipline, became the young man who surrendered at the cross in 1934 and never turned his eyes away from God's call. His years of training at the Florida Bible Institute taught him to preach to trees and birds until his voice carried with conviction before great crowds. That lonely surrender on a golf course, with tears streaming down his face, was a hidden moment when heaven sealed a lifelong covenant with the gospel. Baptism and ordination later confirmed before men what God had already confirmed in his heart. Billy was called to be a preacher. At Wheaton College, he found not only academic preparation, but also the love of Ruth Bell, who would become his spiritual and human anchor. Their 1943 marriage was more than a romantic union. It was a missionary alliance, built to sustain a work that would demand sacrifice, courage, and faithfulness. His first pastorate in Western Springs showed him that even a small congregation could be a laboratory of revival, especially when God opened the door to radio through the program Songs of the Night, sending the message of the cross into homes, hospitals, and military barracks. His involvement with Youth for Christ in 1945 took him from small chapels to packed auditoriums, teaching him how to reach a generation scarred by war. Preaching to soldiers and students, he honed his boldness and shaped the direct appeal that would later define his style. The journeys of 1946 and 1947, including to a devastated Europe, expanded his vision. The gospel was not just a personal answer, but a balm for broken nations. In 1947, as president of Northwestern Schools, he proved himself a leader, administrator, and strategist, establishing the Modesto Manifesto as a code of integrity that would safeguard his ministry. Every step, every role, every lesson was preparation. And then came Los Angeles, 1949, the canvas cathedral that became the epicenter of a spiritual earthquake. What was meant to last 3 weeks stretched into 8, drawing massive crowds, converting celebrities, filling newspapers and shaking the nation. There, under the glare of headlines and spotlights, Billy Graham was no longer just a promising preacher. He became the voice of a national revival. Los Angeles marked the public confirmation of everything God had been shaping since that night of conversion in 1934. Thus ends this first episode. The story of an ordinary young man who, by saying yes to God's call, became an instrument of collective transformation, revival, fire, spiritual revolution. The renewal of faith and eternal impact were no longer distant promises, but a living reality before an entire generation. And yet, this is only the beginning. The stage now widens. If Los Angeles made him the preacher of a nation, the next chapter will unveil him as the preacher to the nations. Get ready. For in episode 2, we'll see how this voice crossed oceans, lifted multitudes in stadiums across the globe, and wrote one of the most epic chapters of Christian faith in the 20th century. My friend, if this message has spoken to your heart, don't let it fade into forgetfulness. Take action now. Click subscribe and join thousands of people who are experiencing a spiritual awakening to the Word of God. Turn on the notification bell, because every new episode could be the very answer you've been praying for. Also, leave your like. This simple act helps this message reach other lives who need hope today. But I want to go even further. Write in the comments what the Holy Spirit spoke to you through this video, or what decision you're making today before the cross. Your testimony might be exactly what another heart needs to keep holding on to faith. Remember, faith without action is dead. So act now. Declare your faith publicly and become an active part of this revival that is already transforming lives and can transform yours too.